Good evening, everybody. It's Dwain McFarland back with another episode of the RSP Fantasy Film and Data. As always, joined by the best film breakdown guy in the business, at least on Twitter, Jay. That's you. How are you doing, buddy?
Oh man, that's high praise. I don't know if I've quite earned it just yet. There are a lot of people out there doing really great work. Listeners, we took a little hiatus for Thanksgiving, but Dwain and I are very excited to get back at it. Fantasy playoffs starting off. We're going to touch on some, very interesting players today. So let's go ahead and get it going, Dwain.
Yeah, before we jump into any players, I have to ask, you know me, I live in Dallas. I'm a big Cowboys fan. Very, very frustrating team this season. I'm just wondering, Jay, what have you seen? If you listen to the local media here, the ultimately the theme, the pervasive themes you continue to hear is that, the talent is there, but it's just an issue with coaching is why, Dallas is so inconsistent. So, we got the game coming up tonight. I just thought I'd throw that out there to you off the top. What are your thoughts about Dallas, and what have you seen?
Yeah, I agree with your take that they're a very talented roster on offense and defense. Prescott, Elliott, and Cooper, obviously very skilled, out there as the skill guys, but then also a very good offensive line. And then on defense, with DeMarcus Lawrence, Jalen Smith, Leighton Vander Esch, who's obviously, injured right now, but even Sean Lee is a very good linebacker. And then they have some pretty good defensive backs out there in the secondary. So, 6-6 and maybe the worst division in football is definitely surprising. And I think what I've noticed about Jason Garrett, aside from the scheme stuff, and there's a lot of critique, especially of their offense in terms of their offensive scheme and forcing, runs to Ezekiel Elliott, forcing touches, etc., whether that's the most efficient approach. To me, it seems like it's a lot of the sort of overall, high-level stuff with being a head coach, the organization, picking up on every edge. When you see him interviewed, about fourth down decisions, with Jason Garrett tends to be very conservative. He often says he goes with his gut. He's sort of derided for not knowing the analytics, knowing the odds of going for it in certain situations. They'll do things like, they're down 7 points with 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter and they're punting from their own 40-yard line. And you're like, well, I don't know if that's the best move there. And then, you see last week when they play the Patriots just murdered them on special teams. Offensively, defensively, the teams were pretty evenly matched, but the Patriots just had such a big edge in, the small things about playing football, the special teams, the details, procedural penalties, etc. And to me, I've seen no indication from Garrett that he's really on top of all the detail, has that attention to detail that a coach like Bill Belichick or other great coaches like Sean Payton have, where and you can see that they're doing everything they can to get a winning edge in every aspect of the game. And that's really the head coach's job. So that's the main thing I've noticed.
Yeah, it's interesting. The special teams were definitely a major problem against, the Patriots. But, them coming out, going down the field, the first drive against Buffalo, getting 7 points, spreading the ball around. You got Amari Cooper involved in the game early. It looked like, things were going their way. And it just seems like it's, either it's an ill-timed penalty or Dak holding onto the ball maybe a tad too long, in which Dak's really played well this season. I wouldn't, if I were to have to pick somewhere to place a lot of this blame, yeah, Dak has had some games where he definitely contributed to the loss, but he's also a part of the reason why they were actually in the game to begin with. But it just seems like at the worst times, there's a, hold on the ball a tad too long. You have a fumble. You've got some sort of penalty. Like you said, you've got some sort of special teams error where you get your punt blocked, or, you don't advise your kick returner, Tony Pollard, to move up despite, 3 short kicks already in the game, 2 of which had already almost been fumbled to the Patriots. There were other plays in that game, Jay, where Randall Cobb had a fumble where it came back to him. Blake Jarwin had a fumble where it actually came back to him. It could have even been worse against the Patriots. But just one other quick question for you on this. So, we hear the example Bill Belichick all the time. You hear Sean Payton. But why aren't more coaches good at this? Why does Bill Belichick have the market so cornered when it comes to, I mean, he's literally on a pedestal by himself. I wouldn't even put Sean Payton on his level. I mean, what does he do that's so different that allows, and you may not have the answer to this, obviously it's a it's a big question, but I know a lot of folks wonder. It's just amazing to me that he can be so much better than everyone else.
Well, I mean, when you see Bill Belichick interviewed, if he gets a good, solid football or strategical question, his answers, just the level of thought that goes into everything that he's doing. I mean, really, to me, it just gets down to that attention to detail with everything. He mentioned in discussing the blocked punt that New England had. He's talking about, oh, the wind is blowing from one direction of the field to the other, so he figured the punter would probably punt it to his left, so he sent pressure off the left side. I'm someone who's been obviously not in an official capacity, but been, really interested and passionate about football my entire life, and I've never once heard anyone else mention that as something to consider on a punt. And you're like, this guy's going 5, 6, 7, 8 levels deep in terms of his attention to detail. And when you learn about Bill Belichick, it's just really that he's just had a passion for football his entire life and is just constantly consuming educational material on any offensive system, defensive system, football strategy. And he really just has an encyclopedic knowledge of those things, and is obviously able to translate that knowledge into composed, informed decision making, both in practice and then also executing those same decisions on Sundays. So it's really impressive, and I mean, just speaks to who he is and his passion for football. That really has embodied his whole career. So very impressive. I don't know if there's an easy answer for how someone can replicate it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
A lot of hard work.
It's I think it's something, that we'll look back on, and I don't know that anyone will be able to duplicate, what he's done,
Yeah,
ever.
and I mean, even when you look at how coaching promotions work, it's usually the coordinators, the hot coordinators at the time because of the scheme. And those traits, having knowledge of a specific offensive scheme is just such a small slice of the pie of what it takes to be a head coach. When you start talking about, people management, planning practices, planning, off-season training sessions, hiring your assistant coaching staff, there's just so many more things that go into being a head coach than just the scheme. And, those coaches that excel in the scheme are the ones that are promoted to the jobs. So the educational process, the promotional process for coaches doesn't necessarily lend itself well to developing good head coaches.
Yeah. Well, speaking of excelling, let's jump over into some players and not excelling. Let's talk about a few players. Just a few months ago, if we think about, fantasy drafts, let's talk about a few runners first. And we'll start with Derrick Henry. This is a guy that you could get in the 4th and 5th rounds of most fantasy drafts, Jay. He's a guy that I was very cold on just based on the way that he does get used, which, most of his production comes in these games where, Tennessee is winning. Anytime Tennessee gets into a neutral game script or a trailing game script, his usage, tends to go down. That trend is not completely gone away. And it's not so much about a guy like Dion Lewis coming on the field and getting touches, but it is about, Dion Lewis coming on the field and getting snaps. But if you look at, Derrick Henry just over the last several weeks, I mean, he's a guy that's probably, if you've got him on your fantasy team and you were anywhere close to making the playoffs, he's put you into the playoffs because week 9 in a PPR format, 25 points, week 10, 33 points, week 12, 31 points. And then last week, he scored 26 points. So he's averaging 19 points on the season. Before that, it had been 17, 12, 12, 14, 4, 18, 9. So he's on a real hot streak right now. I mean, and then if you look at, the margins of victory, for, the Titans in these games, most of these games that I'm talking about, so they won by 17 points, correlated with 26 points. You win by 13 points, he's got 31 points. You got a game where they win by 3 points, he gets 33 points. You got a game that you lose by 6, so you're still within a touchdown, he gets 25 points. So over these last several games, Tennessee's been able to keep the game scripts, really close. And that's been, a good thing whenever it comes to Derrick Henry and his production. So what are your thoughts on Derrick Henry? What are you seeing? Obviously, his yards after contact, as you would expect, they're big. He's getting 4.9 yards per carry, Jay. 4.1 of those come after contact. He's avoiding a tackle on 20% of his carries, which is, right around the league average. So it's not like he's eluding a lot of tacklers, but he is constantly gaining yardage moving forward. He's got 229 fantasy points, so he's the 4th ranked fantasy running back. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on him, where he's at, in his, career arc with the things that you're seeing. And do we think he's a guy that's around to stay? We're going to have to, think more about next year as we go into fantasy drafts, or, is he a guy that continues to have a limited skill set? What do you think about Derrick Henry?
Well, Dwayne, I've never been a huge fan of Henry. If you've seen my work on the RSP and Twitter, I focus a lot on, sort of the conceptual foundations of running back play, a lot of, the craft of running back play, rather than just, picking the big fast guys. And I think Henry, may be the supreme, at least big guy. And, he's still pretty fast in the NFL. And I think just, one thing that stood out to me through his career is as the season wears on, he seems to get better and better. And, defenses accrue injuries, players are banged and bruised. He's just an Iron Man. You go back to his college days when he's getting 30, 40 carries a game at Alabama. He's never really had any significant injury history. He's just a tank. He doesn't wear down, and he gets against these worn-out defenses at the end of the year, and you have this huge, fast running back who is very adept at breaking tackles. He has very long limbs, a good stiff arm. He's good at, avoiding leg contact by using his upper body to ward off defenders. And, once the defenders slow down and you're not getting guys gang tackling, he breaks a tackle or two, and he has very good speed to take it to the house. And, you saw that last year against Jacksonville where he just embarrassed them. And, he's starting to do the same thing this year. So that's really, what I think about Henry. I would say, over the past 4 weeks, he's really taken off. He's been somewhat consistent the whole year, but, they faced some pretty bad run defenses: Carolina, Jacksonville, Kansas City, and Indianapolis. So that, not necessarily tearing up a murderer's row in terms of run defenses. So just something to pay attention to as we go forward. And, you have a running back, and this is something that I've noticed as I've studied running backs more and more, is if you don't have, disciplined reads, disciplined footwork, going through a proper process as a back, often these guys will have success against, run defenses that aren't as strong. The good athletes will have more success against those type of defenses. But then when they go against the really good defenses, they can struggle a bit. And, Henry doesn't always read it right. He doesn't always have balanced footwork. He often struggles against penetration. So, as you go through his career, he may struggle more against those good run defenses than a running back like Dalvin Cook, who is very sound in, all of the skill factors of running back play, and, is often more resistant to bad matchups.
Yeah, it is interesting when you look at the last 2 seasons. Over the last 3 weeks, you've had 188, 159, and 149 rush yards. The year before, in a similar span in the season, you mentioned the Jacksonville game, so 238 yards, 170 yards, 84 yards, and 93 yards to close out last season. So definitely, he is someone that has, done well towards the end of the season. It's not that he's done bad this year. I mean, his yards each game: 84, 82, 44, 100, 78, 28, 90, 75, 63. So, I mean, he's actually been better, as far as at least getting around, the 70-yard mark every game, this season versus last year. And the Titans, if you look at, their schedule and the way that things have played out, most of their games have been fairly close. They've had a few games that have gotten out of hand on them. But now, in these last couple of weeks, like you said, the matchups have been good. So Kansas City was obviously a great matchup. That's 188 yards. Jacksonville last week was another, or the week before last was a solid matchup, 159 yards. He just loves playing Jacksonville. And then you have Indianapolis, which is actually had been a pretty good run defense, but Tennessee got out ahead of them. They won the game 31-17. So there was plenty of opportunity for attempts, 26 attempts for 149 yards. But what's interesting about Henry is, in games where they're winning and the defense, the opposing defense is expecting run, he still averages really well as far as his yards per carry, where a lot of times, runners that are getting those extra 10 carries a game because their team is ahead, you'll notice their yards per carry a lot of times will actually go down unless they break a big run, because the opposing defense is actually just expecting you to try to run the clock out. So they start stacking the box and doing different things. But with Henry, for whatever reason, that seems to lead to these, really big plays.
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, to those defenses that you mentioned, I just looked it up, Football Outsiders, DVOA. Carolina is the 32nd ranked run defense in terms of DVOA. Jacksonville's 31. Kansas City's 30.
Mm-hmm.
So the three worst rush defenses by DVOA. And then, you have Indianapolis, who's 21st. So definitely matchups conducive to running backs excelling. Derrick Henry, when you mention his ability to close out games, and I think a lot of times these psychological factors are, derided in terms of football commentary. But, human psychology is a real thing. And having been around the game, played the game, coached players for 7 years, players saying, I don't want to tackle this guy is a real thing. And, I've seen it happen, not at an NFL level, never been around those guys. But I wouldn't be surprised if when teams are losing and, the Titans are running out the clock and you see, 250-pound Derrick Henry running at you, there's a little bit inside of you that's saying, man, I really don't want to tackle this guy for the 25th time this game. And I wouldn't be surprised if that has something to do with his success, both late in the season and then also late in games. And then, just speaking more to his fantasy potential, the thing about Henry is the Titans have a strong offensive line. They have an offense they want to run the ball. You already went over their numbers in terms of their frequencies, especially when they're even or ahead, they want to run the ball. And then when they're down in the red zone, no one else on that team is getting goal line carries. Derrick Henry is going to get all the goal line carries. So essentially, every rushing touchdown that they have from a running back is going to be by way of Derrick Henry's legs. So, it's really a situation that's conducive to really good production. And Derrick Henry, he's probably, like I said, the supreme size, speed, prospect at running back in the NFL.
Yeah, he and Fournette, but Fournette's had the ankle issues. So, what are your thoughts? I'm just sitting here now, and I'm already starting to reflect some as far as next year. Obviously, if you've got Derrick Henry on your fantasy team, you don't need us to tell you you're going to be starting him, in your fantasy playoffs. But as you start thinking, you start gearing up for next year, is Henry, because this year Henry's a guy that I had sitting, like running back 18, 16, somewhere in there. I can't remember exactly where you had him. I know we talked about him, but is he a guy that you see liking more next year, or do you think you're going to have some of the same concerns?
You always start to worry when guys are building up or, get thinning the tread on their tires in terms of running back play. So you always have to worry about injury with a guy who's just been, such a carry hog for his whole career, even, as I said, dating back to his days at Alabama. But unless they add some kind of significant, additional running back, you have to assume that he's going to have a similar role. I don't see Tennessee changing up its coaching staff. They have a first-year offensive coordinator who has done a pretty decent job, especially once Ryan Tannehill's gotten some action. So I don't think they'll change, their offensive play calling staff. And assuming the situation doesn't change, then I don't see any reason why, you wouldn't consider Derrick Henry, top 5 running back heading into 2020.
Well, let's talk about another guy, and this is a little bit opposite, right? So Derrick Henry's a guy that you could have got in the mid rounds, and he's performing now like a guy that, if we were to draft today, a lot of folks might consider taking Derrick Henry in the first round of a fantasy draft. But let's talk about Saquon Barkley. Obviously, some of this is due to injury. He's missed a few games. He might be a little nicked up. You have Barkley sitting at running back 17 in a PPR format, was quite often the number one pick, in a fantasy draft this summer. If he wasn't, he was probably the number two. And so, this is a guy that if you looked at him, one of the things I talked about in the preseason, Jay, and I know you've talked about the style of Barkley, is Barkley really relied a lot on the big plays. Last year, over 54% of his yards came after 15 yards. And, his breakaway, per attempt, was really high last season. And right now, this year, if you look at, his same percentages for those things, 26% of his yards have come after 15 yards. So 144 yards versus last year, 700 of his yards came that way. And so he's only breaking away. He's only getting a 15-yard or more carry on 3.6% of his attempts, which is below the league average. Last year, he actually led the league in that category as far as big plays go. So Barkley is a guy that we know some of why he's ranked 17 is due to missing time, but there's also a performance issue. Something's going on here, that's different with Barkley. And just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Any thoughts around, the explosiveness, his ability to break the big plays, and any insights? I know that we may have talked about this a little in the past, but, to his style and why that may be more problematic for a back like him.
Well, again, I like to get back to the craft of running back play. And I've really started to, become convinced of this idea that, the backs who are more fundamentally sound, you talk about scheme knowledge, scheme discipline, processing post-snap changes, linebackers, processing offensive line leverage, making the reads quickly, disciplined cuts, not bouncing out when it's not supposed to be there. Those guys are really the ones that can operate when the blocking is not supreme. And, last year, Saquon Barkley's blocking was not excellent by any means. The Giants' offensive line was not very good. But he had that elite explosiveness. And so if there's anything that gets in the way of that elite explosion, acceleration, balance, agility, he hadn't quite. And, he's actually improved in terms of his craft at running back this year. Showed some really nice gains, before he had the high ankle sprain early in the year. So he has made some strides from year one to year two in that area. But, when you have a high ankle sprain, it's really hard to have that top end elite explosion to where, you look at his big runs last year, often he's making a guy miss by literally inches, making a bounce out or a cutback. That's not necessarily how you would coach it up. And so if he can't move, quite as fast as he could last year, that ends up being a tackle for a loss or a short run. And so, my hunch is that his ankle sprain, even though he's healthy enough to play, is limiting him somewhat. And then he doesn't have like the fundamental, skills at running back to really, grind out those 4, 5, 6, 7-yard runs through, tight spaces. Guys who do that well, or someone like, I've already talked about Dalvin Cook, like Josh Jacobs, you routinely see him running through very tight spaces, spaces that most running backs wouldn't even perceive there's somewhere to go. And so Saquon typically likes to see a bit of daylight, whether it's where it's supposed to be or somewhere else, and then attacks that. But if he doesn't have that explosiveness, then it could be a problem.
So do you see Saquon as being a guy that could just be a lot more volatile than what folks originally thought, over the course of his career? Because coming into this season, he was like we said, the clear number one pick. He's the guy, most people wanted to roster despite knowing that there's probably going to be problems, with the Giants offense. We knew at some point Daniel Jones would be playing. We knew, that their offensive line wasn't great. They had made some additions through the draft the previous year with Will Hernandez, and they had, made some offseason acquisitions via trade. But we knew it wouldn't be a great offensive line. And you and Matt Waldman and others had talked about some of these issues with Barkley. Do you see this as potentially being something where, and this isn't a good example of like a compare. I'm not trying to make a comparison here, but if you think back to Darren McFadden and how, and he was never as elite as Barkley, but he would have like this decent fantasy season and then he would just have a clunker. And it seemed like there was a lot of variance, in his game. And do you see that being something that could also be true with Barkley?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear that and it sounds like you feel the same way. Barkley is, an elite talent at running back, and he's a guy that, potentially when you're talking about dynasty leagues, et cetera, this offseason could be a great time to buy low, especially if he continues to play and not play up to the caliber we expect. There are a few things that I think could help him from, a scheme standpoint. One would be, using him as a downfield receiver a bit more. That was one of his, if you recall, coming out of college, Penn State ran him downfield, a decent amount, especially by college standards. Had some really good plays running, go routes or, angle routes out of the backfield. And the Giants don't really use him that way, especially not this year. And his production in the passing game has decreased significantly from his rookie year. And again, some of that may be related to injury and they're trying to, conserve him, but, it's all just speculation. The other thing I worry about is, I'm not a big fan, never have been, at least thus far based on his college and early NFL tape of Daniel Jones. I think he's a guy who has a lot of issues processing the field, and it results in, very frequent turnovers. And you've seen him, throw a large number of interceptions, and, his fumble rate is up near the highest ever recorded for quarterbacks. So I worry about Daniel Jones being able to, operate and maintain a high level NFL passing game to help open up the running lanes for Barkley. If I'm a defensive coach coming in against the Giants, my goal would be to stop Barkley and, dare Daniel Jones to beat us through the air.
Right. Well, so we've got another guy that's similar, to Barkley, not the first overall pick, but if you've got a guy, we're going to talk about Joe Mixon now and the Bengals. This is a guy that was taken, at the end of the first round or early, sometimes in the second round. Towards the end of the summer, he was starting to slip a little bit more towards the mid and late second round in a lot of the drafts that I was doing. But still a guy that, fantasy owners put a decent pick into, right? You don't want your second round pick to be, basically a complete miss, which at this point, you may be flexing Mixon if you start a lot of players, but he's not a guy you feel really, great about having in your lineup. He's right behind Saquon Barkley. Actually, he's the number 18 running back in PPR formats. He's got 644 rushing yards. He's averaging 3.5 yards per carry. He's started to pick up things as far as receiving out of the backfield over the last couple of games, but still not a lot of work there. And if you look at, his yards after contact, it's 2.5 yards. He's making a tackle or miss on 15%, of his carries. Again, that's a little bit below the league average. But one of the things, that I like to look at, we already talked about it with Barkley, are the number of carries 15 yards or over, and only 17% of his yards have come on those sort of attempts. He's only breaking a tackle. He's only breaking a carry over 15 yards on 3.3%, so slightly worse than what we've seen from Barkley. He's only gotten 108 yards off of those types of carries. But when I'm watching Mixon, and I'm interested to get your thoughts, he still seems like a good runner to me. It just seems like the team is so bad. It's like I don't know how he can overcome it. It's a team that, hasn't had AJ Green all year. Tyler Boyd, as a slot receiver, he's not something that really demands a ton of respect. They're going to get John Ross back if he can stay healthy. You've had Andy Dalton out of the lineup for the last several games until this, with a rookie quarterback with Ryan Finley in there. Now you get Dalton back in, but it just seems to be, in the offensive line issues they've had, it seems to be kind of one thing after another. And obviously the Bengals have only won one game. So I wanted to get your thoughts on Mixon and where your head is at on him as we start thinking about him as a prospect for next season, because my gut says is that Mixon, next year you probably get him as a third or fourth round pick due to recency bias. And to me, he looks like a guy that still is a decent player, but was in a really bad situation this year.
Yeah, Dwayne, I think there's a lot to unpack with Mixon. I guess first we could start with the player. I sort of think of Mixon, in my opinion of Mixon based on watching him, is almost that he's in the same mold as Saquon, maybe a poor man's Saquon Barkley. Very good balance, agility. He's explosive, not quite as fast, not quite as explosive, or, doesn't accelerate quite as well as Barkley when Barkley's healthy. But also like Saquon, excellent receiver out of the backfield, ran a lot of downfield routes at Oklahoma. So he is a talented back. He doesn't necessarily have, consistent discipline, consistent, excellent, processing. You'll see him miss reads, you'll see him miss holes occasionally, not all the time, but he's sort of middle of the pack in terms of his vision. All the things that go into vision. And then after understanding who he is as a player, then you want to think about the surrounding talent, the surrounding scheme. Obviously, the Bengals offense has been anemic. One of the worst offenses in the NFL, one of the worst teams in the NFL. So they're playing from behind almost every game. They just won their first game last week. They had Ryan Finley in the past several weeks, who at this point in his career is not really a functional NFL quarterback. So obviously that hurts the overall offensive productivity. And so when you have a running back in a bad offense on a team that's losing a lot of games, the opportunity isn't necessarily going to be there. And then their offensive line is, when I study them, they're one of the worst offensive line units that I see on a week-to-week basis in the NFL. Routinely losing individual battles, double teams that are stalemates all the time, or the defensive tackle splitting the double team. And if you're running like duo or inside zone, these inside run plays where you're trying to displace the defense upfield, if you can't get a push for your double teams and combo blocks with, the guard center or the guard tackle, you're going to have a lot of trouble moving the ball effectively. And it's, an ongoing problem for the Bengals. So a lot of things stacked against Mixon, but, situations can change. So I do think that his talent is higher than his, draft position, or the value, the consensus value will be for him going into next season. So potentially a guy that, you can buy low, and, he's still very young. I think he's like 22, 23 years old, came into the league young. So he should have, several more years left of NFL production. And if the Bengals can improve their offensive line, get Jonah Williams back, and, also just use Mixon a little better situationally. I talked about his pass catching skill. I have an ongoing, bit on Twitter where every week I, sort of make fun of the Bengals for not using the Joe Mixon as a receiver. They have Gio Bernard, but he's just not nearly as explosive in space as Mixon, and Mixon's really just running check down routes for the most part. And when he gets the ball, does well on those targets, but you'd like to see him used as a downfield receiver. So hopefully they can figure that out, get him some more production. That would obviously be huge in those PPR formats.
Well, I mean, speaking of a backfield where they're really splitting up the work, like what you talked about with Gio Bernard, I think, the situation that we have to talk about, for the listeners, and this is applicable as far as thinking about next year, but this also probably has pretty big implications for folks as they just think about what they're going to be doing, over the next couple of weeks, in their fantasy playoffs. They may be, in their fantasy championship. Some folks are already. Some folks, if you're like in leagues like what I'm in, I've still got, our playoffs are just now starting. But let's talk a little bit about Chris Carson and Rashaad Penny. So I think, the positives here for me, Jay, you've got a team that runs the ball the sixth most in the league. They only drop back to pass. So that's not actually attempting a pass, but actually dropping back to pass 56% of the time. So they stay committed to the run. They're also running a lot more plays than what we saw from them last year. They actually run 67 plays a game, which is the sixth most in the NFL. So you've got an offense that is running a lot of plays. You've got an offense that runs the ball a lot. So it is one of the few fertile situations for where you can have two running backs actually be viable, right, from a fantasy perspective. And if you look at the last couple of weeks, so up until, week 11, when the Seahawks had their bye, it had really been all about Chris Carson. If I'm talking snaps here, over 70% and over 80% of the snaps, almost every game. Week 10 had played 96% of the snaps. Rashaad Penny had 3 games where he had gotten up into the 30% range. But really, outside of that, had, some games where he didn't see a snap at all, was seeing 3%, 4%. Well, now you come out of the bye week. Chris Carson, 51% of the snaps versus 49% for Rashaad Penny, 52% for Carson versus 47% for Rashaad Penny. And what's interesting is they're using them in different ways. In week 12, Chris Carson really carried the load as far as, the receiving work. He ran a route on 47% of Russell Wilson's dropbacks. Rashaad Penny only did that on 25%, but Rashaad Penny carried the load as far as, being the runner, 54% of the carries, 31% for Chris Carson. Then last week, that all flip-flopped. It was Chris Carson leading the team in the rushing attempts with 55%, Rashaad Penny at 36%, for the rushing, but then led the way in the passing game. He was the guy running a route on 53% of Russell Williams' dropbacks. He saw 16% of the targets, including 1 target in the end zone. Both players had 2 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line last week. So this looks like right now, Jay, almost a 50-50 split, a very, very slight margin to Chris Carson, but really a true running back by committee. You've almost got this 1A, 1B situation going on. What are your thoughts right now around these 2 backs, and how confident are you in Rashaad Penny being able to keep something like this up for the fantasy playoffs?
Well, Rashaad Penny's another one of those guys, size, speed, phenom, drafted in the first round because of, his physical qualities. At San Diego State, ran in a very gap-heavy scheme, and their offensive line at San Diego State was excellent. He's often running through large gaps, and he's not playing top-level, Big Five, Power 5 competition at San Diego State. So he'd get against these overmatched defensive backs and, give him a stiff arm, break a tackle, break off a big run. So he had those high yards after contact numbers. But when he got to the NFL and the Seahawks run a fair amount of zone and, duo concepts where, as opposed to gap and man runs, you're not told to run to a specific place. And, it's more about timing your attack through the hole on those gap runs. Instead, you have to read across, 2, 3, 4 gaps, looking at the linebacker, feeling the defensive lineman, and really staying balanced so you can attack any one of those 4 gaps based on, your processing all within, 1 to 2 second window while you're working your way towards the handoff and getting up to the line of scrimmage. And Penny really struggled with this as a rookie and early this year. Recently, when they played the Eagles, before this past week, I broke it down on Twitter, actually, with a video where I was very impressed with Penny's improvement, making reads, executing reads, his footwork, his ability to make, secondary cuts off of his reads, both on a wide zone play and a duo play, 2 plays that, have not been in his wheelhouse thus far. And, really impressive improvement. And so I think that, with his physical skills, if he can develop some of the skill set of what the Seahawks are looking for with their zone style running game, he has a pretty high ceiling. And then the other thing for Chris Carson, who I also think is a very good back, explosive, breaks a lot of tackles, very agile. His big issue has been fumbles. He's up there at the top of the league in terms of fumbles. And when you're a running back, the one thing you can't do consistently is fumble. And often that results in decreased playing time, more so than any other thing as a running back. So those 2 things combined, I wasn't surprised that last week it was more of an even split between the 2. And I wouldn't be surprised if that keeps up because I think Penny has improved, pretty substantially.
That's a great breakdown. So what you're actually seeing on film is him improving in the areas that he had struggled with in the past. And one of the reasons where I know you just weren't very high on him, in the preseason. So we already talked about this being an offense that could support it. So to me, that means that Penny is a guy that, if you've stashed him and you've kept him all this time, he's a viable, flex play. I think this does bring down the ceiling for Carson. It also brings down Carson's floor on a weekly basis. Plus, to your point, if for some reason if Carson fumbles in a game, We could see even more Rashaad Penny if they're starting to trust him more. So I think this is slightly bad news for Chris Carson, but you can still play him because of the way this offense works. And then Rashaad Penny, it's great for him. If you're looking at the last couple of weeks, just the raw production, for the guy, he's had 15 attempts and then he's had 14 attempts. And I mean, his obviously in week 12, he had some huge plays. He had 129 yards. He had a touchdown that game. Then last week he had 74 yards. So he averaged 9 yards per carry in week 12, 4.9 yards in week 13. He's avoiding, quite a few tacklers, and they're getting him opportunities in the red zone and down towards the 5-yard line, like I talked about earlier, which they're also still doing for Chris Carson. So both guys, it's not like they specifically just have one role, for each guy. They're using them both in a variety of ways, and it almost feels like they're interchangeable in the Seahawks game plan. So talking about another back.
Yeah, I mean, I think their style of play is not necessarily the same, but they're similar in terms of, what they can do well, in terms of running the ball and also being able to catch a little bit. So not much in terms of how they play distinguishes.
Right. So another guy that I want to make sure that we get to, we've got a few minutes left here. And I think this is a guy that you might be writing about this week for the RSP, and that is Derrius Guice. So Guice, this past week, obviously had a huge game, scored 2 touchdowns, had some long plays. But if you look at, from a distribution standpoint, I don't know, man. This is a guy that I struggle to see how I have him actually on a couple of rosters. I'm not sure if I trust him to put him in my lineup as far as, the fantasy playoffs go. I mean, it really comes down to the roster construction and what else is available. But over the last 3 weeks, 14 fantasy PPR points, 5 PPR, and then 28. But the thing that, worries me, and you'll obviously get more into what you're seeing on the film with guys, but from a utilization standpoint, 30% of the snaps this past week, 36% for Chris Carson, 36% for Adrian Peterson. The week before, when Chris Thompson didn't play, it was a similar situation. Still, Wendell Smallwood saw 28% of the snaps, 41% for Guice, and 34% for Adrian Peterson. So it seems like this is a deal where Callahan is really he wants to use 3 backs right now. I think Guice obviously is the guy that shows the most explosion. Guice has gotten all 3 of the rushing attempts inside the 5 over the last 3 weeks, whereas there's 0 for Peterson or any of the other backs. So I think that's a positive for him. But if you look at routes per drop back, and he's actually he did some okay things as a receiver in this past game, but he's really not out there a lot. So only 22% of the time was he running a route, whereas Chris Thompson was running a route on 41% of those plays. Adrian Peterson, 16% of the times that Dwayne Haskins dropped back to pass, he was actually running a route. And each of the guys, Peterson had 4% of the targets, Thompson had 8%, Guice had 8%. So I'm very encouraged by what I see from Guice. I'd like to hear more from you on that. But as far as trusting him and inserting him in a fantasy lineup, man, I'm still just it's a team that's not very good. We've got a rookie quarterback. They do want to run the ball, but they run the least plays. We talked about Seattle being a viable spot for 2 runners. Well, this is the opposite. You've got 3 runners on a team that runs the least plays in the league, only 54 plays per game. Now, they've gotten a little better over the last 3 weeks as they've gotten their feet under them a little bit. Now, some of it's been competition as well. They've played, some pretty easy matchups, but they've had 62 plays, 56 plays, and 60 plays in week 11, 12, and 13. But it's just a situation for me that's a little bit tough to trust. But what are your thoughts, Jay, on Derrius Guice and the rest of this Washington backfield?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you just, provided a great breakdown, and I'll add to it a little bit in terms of what I saw last week, which, really was one of the more exciting things that I've watched, studying running backs over this year. I agree the situation is terrible, and I think, really last week his production was obviously bolstered by the fact that they were playing against the worst rushing defense in the NFL in the Carolina. So don't know if his, statistical success will carry over in the remaining weeks of the season, given all the limitations that you just broke down so thoroughly. But what I will say is, it wasn't like Guice was just running through giant holes that his offensive line had created. There's a 4-play stretch he had, I think, 13 carries. It was, 4 of his last 5 carries were really just some of the more impressive stuff you'll see in terms of, running back skill, the stuff that we've already talked about. I've already mentioned so much as we've gone through this episode. He starts off getting his feet wet a little bit, but then as he gets his rhythm, there's a wide zone play to the right where the middle linebacker penetrates very quickly. Guice is able to go through his whole read, in a very compressed time frame because of this penetration, has the balanced footwork, and again, Guice is, a very big, powerful runner, but makes an excellent cutback, textbook in terms of processing and reading. And, it ends up being a 6-yard run only because the left guard, instead of going to the second level, which he should on a wide zone, outside zone run play, he sort of stops in the cutback lane and Guice runs into him, has to go around him to get back upfield. But, really an excellent run. His next carry, he runs duo, which is a block where all the linemen block down on the front side and the running back reads the middle linebacker. And essentially, to simplify it a bit, wherever the middle linebacker goes, the running back is supposed to go opposite. So again, makes a perfect read. The outside linebacker has 2 gaps to cover. Guice approaches behind his blocker, gives a jab step one way, gets the linebacker to bite, and then hits the other hole, expertly manipulating that second level defender. And that's something that I really enjoy watching, something I look for in these running backs. And you see it a lot with guys who have great feet. Often the smaller guys like Dalvin Cook, Philip Lindsay does this extremely well. LaShawn McCoy, I posted an example of him doing that this year. To see a guy like Guice do it with his, physical capabilities and his power was pretty cool, because often those powerful backs just, sometimes can run into contact because they're so good at picking up yards through contact. The next play, he runs a duo again, and, there's not really a hole there, but he turns his shoulders, reads the slightest leverage of his blockers, squeezes through the tiniest little crease, gets to the second level, picks up 8 yards. And by now I'm like, man, I'm all excited. And then the next player comes up and it's, his 37-yard run where they run a D-gap power play to the left side. So they pull a lineman. He's running behind a lead blocker, a lead blocking fullback, gets the edge. And then a linebacker comes up and he just gives him one of the more vicious stiff arms that you'll see, puts the linebacker on his back, accelerates away, runs down to the 1-yard line. They called it a touchdown on the field, but got, overturned. But then he ran it in from the 1-yard line on the next play after that. So, this has me frothing at the mouth watching this. And so I think that going forward, and the big question with him is his health. But I think going forward, if he's able to stay healthy, the stuff I saw this past weekend has me very excited about his potential, even in situations where, he's not necessarily running behind a great offensive line.
We would love to see get 20 catches, 20 touches, in a game, versus, the 10 or so, that he's been getting and splitting and carrying that.
Yeah, and, his pass catching, they haven't used him much like that this year, but at LSU, he had very good hands, catches the ball extremely well. And Jay Gruden actually last offseason, his rookie year, mentioned how much better he was as a receiving back than he thought he was going to be. So I think the potential is there. Obviously having a guy like Chris Thompson, it's like a Gio Bernard situation in Cincinnati where that guy just has a specific role. And so, as long as he's there.
Well, speaking of catching the ball, we can't just talk about runners, Jay. We got to talk about a few receivers. I know a guy that you and I talked about a lot this preseason. Well, 2 guys. We talked about DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel, but today we'll focus a little bit more on DJ Moore. I know there's quite a bit of hype right now surrounding DJ Moore. When you and I talked about projections early in the season, DJ Moore was the guy that I had projected to lead Carolina in targets as well as, receptions, but felt there would be more big plays probably come from Curtis Samuel. And, right now, that overall, that's really what we're seeing play out. But Moore is really on, kind of this tear, right now. And he's a popular topic. He's up to wide receiver 8 on the season in a PPR format. So, this is a guy that's really just over the last few weeks has climbed from being down in the low 20s the high 20s up into, really being into the top 10 fantasy wide receivers. If you look at his work over the last several weeks, week 11, 18 PPR points, week 12, 31, then 19 PPR points in week 13. He's now averaging 17 points per game on the season. Obviously, he's a guy that's out on the field all the time. He's seeing a lot of targets, though, 30%, 22%, 26% over the last 3 weeks. He's also all of a sudden seeing a lot of targets in the end zone, which was something that I know you and I specifically talked about, and it was a concern for you with DJ Moore. And that, Curtis Samuel up till this point in the year had led the team in those end zone targets. But now DJ Moore, he has 6 on the season, but he has 5 over the last 3 games. He's got 5 targets in the end zone. So, and this is a player also that, Jay, we've seen his average depth of target really move up. Last year, you were talking 8-9 yard range. Over the last 3 weeks, 11.5, 14.3, 12.8. So not deep down the field, but more in the intermediate space, not just shallow underneath crosser kind of stuff. He's doing some different things, which is helping him from an air yards perspective. Curtis Samuel, on the other hand, last week, 17.4. So he's still stretching the field more than DJ Moore. But if you look at it on the season, Moore's right at a 12 and Curtis Samuel's right at a 15.5. What are you seeing with DJ Moore and, with this breakout, really over the last 3 to 4 weeks where he's become so viable as a fantasy starter?
Well, DJ Moore is interesting because, you and I have talked a lot about sort of the breadth of application of receivers. How many things can they do well? And he's really a guy that is excellent, over a small domain of receiver play, probably elite in that area. And so when he's in an offense that allows him to do what he's good at and that features those skills that he's good at, he's a guy that can produce, substantial numbers, which is what we see this year. And, in terms of getting specific on his strengths, I don't think anyone would disagree with the fact that he's extremely quick. He has great lateral agility. He's a strong player. On those underneath routes, he's aggressive to the ball, catches it well, even with contact, on like a quick slant or, a 10-yard curl, something like that. And then after the catch, he runs very aggressively, breaks a lot of tackles, it becomes a running back once he has the ball in his hands. And so typically where you see him have success is on in-breaking routes like the slants, the digs, the 10, 15-yard in-breaking routes, curls, wide receiver screens. And what he doesn't necessarily do as well are the downfield routes, the deep posts, deep, just go routes, fades. I still haven't seen him really make an easy catch over the shoulder. He tends to try to turn around and catch the ball with his chest towards the quarterback, and sometimes that can cause trouble on those downfield targets where you really, want to adjust your speed so you can run through the catch and catch it over your shoulder. And I think that having a quarterback like Kyle Allen, who really struggles with his accuracy down the field, actually helps DJ Moore when you're talking about having Curtis Samuel on the other side of him as the number 1 and number 2 receiver, because the Panthers really use Curtis Samuel, and he's faster than Moore in terms of straight line speed. They use Curtis Samuel to run a lot of vertical routes to take the tops off the defense. And Samuel draws a lot of attention, often draws the defense's number 1 corner, often runs into safety coverage where he is attracting 2 defenders. And so it opens up the underneath routes for Moore, who is then, targeted by a quarterback who prefers to throw the underneath stuff anyway. And so that's why, DJ Moore ends up with so many targets, and he's good at executing those targets and producing with the targets that he gets. My only concern is that as, you move forward, if you have changes in coordinators, you have changes in quarterbacks, if the scheme or the personnel fit doesn't favor that playing style anymore, you could potentially have a career like Golden Tate where, some years he produces excellent numbers, but some years he's essentially nowhere to be found. And, Tate is my comparison for Moore. And I actually think Tate, while he's not quite as quick and maybe not quite as explosive as Moore, Tate is a guy who does well underneath and runs like a running back after the catch, but I think he tracks the ball a little bit better than Moore does down the field. So even potentially
just for the folks listening that may be thinking dynasty, here, do you,
DJ Moore.
Whenever and we'll often hear, Matt talk about this, the ease of fix, right, of certain traits. When you talk about tracking the ball down the field, hand positioning, and some of the things that you talked about with Moore on deeper throws, is that typically an easy fix, for a wide receiver? Is it a medium type fix, or is it something that, if it's a challenge for them in college and they haven't gotten it by now, is typically something that you just won't see, improve?
Well, improvement is different for any athlete. And I think when a player is having great success overall, putting up good numbers, being very productive, you're less likely to look at your game critically. And, there are unique individuals who will have success and still look to improve. But I think that it produces less of an inclination to try to work on your game. So I haven't seen DJ Moore show great improvement on the weaknesses that he's had dating back to Maryland. The downfield game, the over-the-shoulder throws, high pointing the ball, making downfield catches with contestment. So, and I think tracking the ball is probably one of the harder things to improve as a receiver, because I don't even know. I mean, you can work on it, but, it just seems that some receivers have it, some receivers don't. And I haven't seen guys make great strides with that. But, with other weaknesses in his game, I think that another thing that I didn't mention earlier is that when he runs his routes, I did mention that he likes to turn and have his chest to the quarterback. When he breaks, he'll have a good break. He'll get separation at the break point, but often then he'll turn and look for the ball and slow down a bit. And it's actually good to do that against zone coverages, because he'll find holes in the zone that way and, make eye contact with the quarterback and get targets. But you'll see against man that he gets immediate separation and then it closes. He had an end zone target this week where he ran a slant and the corner's in press coverage, and he gets him, with his release and his break, and there's separation at the break. But then as Kyle Allen goes to throw it, Moore slows down and the corner is able to undercut the route, nearly picks it off in the end zone. And, this was on their goal line stand where they lost the game at the very end of the game there. So something like that is a bit easier to work on, where it's more about, fundamentals and unlearning bad habits, as opposed to ball tracking and being able to attack the ball, which is a very complex, cognitive.
So from a perspective, let me just ask you this real quick. And then if there's another receiver you want to hit on, I know we mentioned a few before the show. We've got 3 or 4 minutes left here. From a DJ Moore perspective. Sure.
Well, let me talk about his counterpart a little bit more, Curtis Samuel. Obviously a guy that I like, have liked going back to this offseason when I really studied his game. He's someone that if the Panthers are able to upgrade their quarterback position, especially a quarterback that can throw the ball downfield accurately, he's a guy that could see a real leap in production. I think, statistically, both Moore and Samuel are up at the top of the list for off-target downfield passes. But when you watch Samuel, he's actually really adept at playing these balls. He's often in a lot of traffic, so they haven't had a lot of success when you talk about the defensive approaches and then also the inaccurate passes. But if he's able to hook up with a quarterback who can throw well downfield, I would expect his production to take off more than DJ Moore's production, and potentially could eat into Moore's production if they have a quarterback who's willing to take more downfield throws, as opposed to
we have seen that actually,
the slants or
and we've seen that and we've already seen that this year. So I mean, there have been periods where really Curtis Samuel has been the lead target on the team, and a lot of this stuff, we've talked about this a little bit before. I certainly talk about this a lot with Brian Drake on the Fantasy Football Hustle. But defenses are looking at typically the last 3 to 4 games, right? When they're studying and getting ready for an opponent. So a lot of times you'll see these ups and downs for, certain weapons in an offense, especially if it's an offense that's willing to be balanced. There's certain offenses, and you've talked about this, where the design is going to be there. They're going to get their targets no matter what, like Michael Thomas. But a situation like Carolina, you've had multiple weeks where DJ Moore has actually led the team, in targets. He led the team in targets in week 3. He led the team in targets in week 4. Then he led the team in targets again week 7. So we've seen, out of the gate, it was DJ Moore the first 2 weeks. Then the next 2 weeks, it was, Curtis Samuel. So I agree with you. I would expect, and I actually talked about this on the Fantasy Football Hustle podcast a couple of weeks ago, that I'm expecting Curtis Samuel to see, he should see improved production here, eventually. So I'm thinking for folks in the fantasy playoffs, I don't know that it necessarily comes at how much of it will come at the expense of DJ Moore, but I still feel good about Curtis Samuel very similarly, to you. So I think that's a really great point that you brought up around Samuel. One last thing. So excuse me. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. I feel better if they
don't have
I'm
with
Kyle
you on
Allen
that one for sure too. And we'll have to see what happens, with Cam Newton or what they do at quarterback. But real quickly, before we jump, I know there's a couple of other receivers we talked about. We won't have time to get to all of them, but is there a certain other receiver you just want to hit on real quick for folks before we, have to sign off for the night? Well,
I don't have anyone in mind. Is there someone that you want to talk about?
But I just find it to be fascinating. A guy that's been in the league this long, had so much promise, had shown so much, and really we've just never seen it all click for him. We've seen slight glimpses of what a guy like him could do, and now, all of a sudden with Ryan Fitzpatrick, we're talking about a guy that actually people can feel very comfortable from a fantasy perspective, which I just really didn't think you would be saying this year. This is a guy that I had really just completely, at this point, written off. But here are his fantasy points each week: 11, 9, 17, 12, 17, 12, 16, 12, 21, 15, 35. That, that's pretty salty. I think he's like number 21 right now in rankings for fantasy. This is a guy that wasn't even drafted in most drafts. So just if you have any closing thoughts on Devontae Parker, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I haven't studied him in great depth this year, but Devontae Parker has always been, a very good athlete, good at playing the ball, contested catches, but a little less refined in his releases, his route running. So when you pair him with a guy like Ryan Fitzpatrick, who is a risk taker at the quarterback position, it's like the cast-offs of the NFL and the fantasy, the fantasy football world. But they're a really good fit together because Fitzpatrick is willing to throw the ball up in a one-on-one situation and trust the receiver to come down with it. And Parker's been able to capitalize on that, pretty consistently this year. So it seems like a good fit in terms of skill set. And they're in situations where they're often losing. Their offense has actually been producing pretty well these past few weeks. So potentially, waiver wire
Absolutely.
ad mid-season that could end up
that'll be it for
winning teams championships. And it's funny because every offseason
everybody's like, just forget it.
League winner hype.
I know.
And this is the one offseason where everybody gave up on him. And, of course.
Great breakdowns as usual tonight. So hopefully folks enjoyed, us bringing the data together, with the film. That's what we do. We're very appreciative to Matt Waldman for allowing us this platform on the RSP. Obviously, if you guys haven't checked out Matt's work, you absolutely should. If you like what you're hearing from us, what you're going to get from Matt's even better. So until next,
Yeah, Dwain, I just saw the other day that Matt has started offering his publication, the 2020 Rookie Scouting Portfolio. I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with it, but, goes into astonishing detail on a huge number of prospects at the skill positions. Probably the prime scouting, publication for those of you in dynasty leagues looking to get ready for your rookie drafts. So that's available for purchase now. He usually sends it out I think, around March, April of 2020, before the draft. So,
Yeah,
really high
absolutely. I
quality
mean, I can't
production there. So definitely
honestly,
look into that if you
I
haven't
can't say
already.
enough about it. I can't think of another resource where I've learned as much as what I've learned from the RSP over the past, almost 10 years that I've been reading it. And just the fact that we get to come on here and do this on, this platform, it's amazing. Honestly, sometimes I'm just kind of like, wow, I can't believe we're actually doing this because, and I know you feel the same way because you love Matt's work and you know how much work goes into, grading these prospects and the amount of detail, like you said, that he goes into. You just learn so much, not just about the players in that year, but just about the game, the way the game works, all of the nuances, and Matt has a really strong process and the way that it's an iterative process that he continues to refine and he walks the readers through what he's done there. So, I mean, you get to go as deep as you want to go into a mind, that is locked on this stuff, for the full season. So yeah, absolutely. If you guys haven't had a chance to order yet, you should. We appreciate you guys listening. The downloads and stuff have been great. Jay and I are very, excited about the way this is going. And good luck to everybody in your fantasy playoffs, unless you happen to be playing myself or Jay. So we'll talk to you next time.